Davies,
Hello.
therapist extraordinaire
Thank you,
of
Alex.
TBH Therapy.
Yes.
I love the name.
Thank you. To be honest.
To be honest, thank you for joining me.
Sure.
You have been instrumental in my growth as a therapist. As you probably know, we've talked quite a bit about it, but thank you for joining me today. I wanted to ask you a lot about your perspective in therapy because I find it fascinating. And I think you bring so much to your work with especially young people.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you a lot about young men and about how you perceive the issues that you've seen. So I'm going to start by asking you what are some of those patterns that you've seen amongst young people, especially young men these days that come into your office?
Yeah, for sure. So it's almost like where to start. Like there's a lot
Yeah.
of different things that I see. I think one thing that's really of relevance is the impact that I see messaging that especially my young men are getting from social media. And it's interesting because I actually see kind of both extremes. I see one end that's like, I need to be this hyper masculine, kind of aggro dude. But then I also see a side that's like, I can't ask a girl out because I'm going to get accused of, being too forward or being a creep or like, oh, like I see on TikTok, like girls just want to, be at the gym, they don't want me to come up and talk to them. So I really see like both kind of extremes without a real clear picture of like, how do I like ride that middle?
Yeah. How come, I guess I'm curious, how come social media is kind of shaping these kids? Is there maybe a lack of guidance at home that you see sometimes? How come people are turning to social media to kind of dictate where they go in terms of their own identity?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I hardly ever hear, my teens and young adults talking about, oh, well, my parents said this or my dad said this. Like almost all of the messaging that they're coming in and talking to me about is this influencer said this or some people on Reddit like said that, like those are the things that I'm hearing from the young people that I work with more so than sort of those closer influences.
Do you think it's a problem in the sense of, so in terms of influencers, I don't think it's any secret that the more extreme my opinion is, the
Right.
more clickbaity it will be.
100%. The more views I get.
Yeah, so the extremes kind of play towards that.
Yeah.
And play towards getting more followers and
Right.
everything like that. So I guess what's the answer? How do we get around maybe some of these role models that a lot of these young people are looking at? How do we, in your opinion, how do we shift that culture of, masculinity being so macho and
Right.
or also the other point of view you said where maybe some fear around
Sure,
approaching women
Yeah.
or
That's a big question.
yes it is.
I mean, I think a lot of it, like the kids come in and they tell me like touch grass, right? And I think that is part of it. Like just having like face to face, like human to human interactions and realizing that, okay, yeah, like most people are not these like really extremist, like opposite ends of the spectrum views. Those are just the things that are getting pushed on my algorithm. And I also recommend specifically to my teens and young people to really intentionally diversify their content. I think it's so easy to get into an echo chamber where it's like, these are the only messages that I'm hearing, So if the only thing I'm ever getting is like, men are bad and men are hurtful and, the like man and a bear thing.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's important also to have like visuals of men who are kind and men who are supportive and men who are good parents and men who are good partners. And
Yeah.
so I really encourage them to seek out like those accounts too,
Yeah.
just to mix the pot a little bit.
Yeah, that's cool that you have those discussions about
Yeah, we
diversifying.
talk about it a lot because
Yeah.
it's such a big part. Do you know what I mean? If I'm not talking about
Yeah.
social media with my 19-year-old, like I'm missing something they're spending, 8 hours a day doing.
Yeah, I find that, and I'm curious if you see the same thing, where if their feed is built on these kind of extremes and that's what is primarily what they're seeing, I think it leads a lot to depression and anxiety because it
100%.
is such an extreme.
Yeah.
And then it's like they don't quite measure up because that's how
Right.
they're comparing themselves.
Right. I'm never going to lift as much as that like gym bro influencer.
Yeah.
You know, or I'm never going to be as like kind and sensitive, you know, as that like relationship influencer.
Yeah.
Like both extremes are not really doable in day-to-day life.
How do you turn them back in, I guess, towards themselves, looking for the answers more internally as opposed to seeking answers on social media?
I think that's a lot of the work of therapy in general, you know, is just finding your own internal source of wisdom and guidance and like what your values are. So I do a lot of work around like values exploration and figuring out like what are the things that are important to me? Is it most important to me to be honest? Is it most important to me to be kind? Is it most important to me to be strong? You know, and there's no wrong answer there. Like whatever it is what it is. But how can I build on that in a way that feels really congruent and in line with the kind of person that I want to be?
Yeah. And how do you deal with clients not knowing the answer to some of those questions? I know a lot with young people. We've talked about it.
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know.
It's fine. It's whatever.
Yeah. So how do you work through that?
So there's a couple different strategies that I'll use. Like sometimes, so I have like actual like little cards with all of the different like values written. And so sometimes we'll like sit on the floor of my office, you know, and literally sort them into piles of like, this one's not important to me at all. Like, oh, this one's the most important to me. And then once we kind of have those things that they've identified as most important, we can go through and have some really interesting conversations. You know, how did you figure out that, you know, generosity was a core value for you? Like, when did you notice that? Is that something that your family shares? Is that something, do you know what I mean? Like, we can really like dig into that. And what it does, it's not really for my information. It's for them to figure out like, oh, this is what matters to me and this is why. And these are the ways that it's relevant for the kind of person that I want to be.
And I'm also curious, when you are working with young people, what role do the parents play in their therapy, or just how do you feel as though the parents affect them in their mental health? Because I from my work, I feel as though parents play a big role in not just shaping their kids, but just dictating, I guess, the path, whether directly or indirectly, in which their kids go. But I'm curious your perspective on the role parents have played, and if you see any patterns with that.
I think it can show up in both helpful and in hurtful ways. I think that some, especially of my like teen boys and young men, they get really rigid messages from their parents and from their family about kind of how they're supposed to show up. And so if there's any piece of them that feels like it doesn't fit, you know, like, oh, well, maybe I want to wear this outfit that my parents or my dad, you know, don't think is appropriate or don't think is masculine. You know, I'm not talking about like gender identity stuff, but just like, oh, I think that shirt's cool, but it's like bright pink or whatever, you know, and it's really like that rigid sometimes for some families. And so in that case, I do a lot of work with the teen about expanding like their own sense of self. We talk about like separation and individuation, which is like the stage of development that teens and adolescents are in. And it's really about figuring out what my identity is, you know, who I am separate from my family unit. I think that's a big part of the work that I do.
Yeah. And how do you help cultivate that, you know, whether it's 1 or 2 hours a week, where the kid then has to go home and deal with, you know, whether it's an abusive parent or a parent that isn't accepting of who they are.
Right.
How do you help them work through that, you know, the rest of the time when they're not in your office?
Yeah. Well, you know, my whole brand, right, is like to be honest. And so I really try to always shoot straight. We've talked about this many times. Like, I think that there's no benefit in pulling, you know, your punches with your client. Like, if I'm seeing a concern or something that I think is impacting them, I want to, you know, gently and empathetically, but I want to bring their attention to that.
Yeah.
And so a metaphor that I use sometimes is like, okay, we can take the car through the car wash and like get it detailed and, you know, shined and waxed and all this stuff. But if you go home and park in the swamp, we're not really making a whole lot of progress here, you know? And so I'm straight up about like, hey, we're doing this really great work on self-acceptance and growth and figuring out who you are. And then you kind of have to go home and it doesn't feel safe to be the authentic version of you, you know, for whatever reason. And that's really tough.
What are some of, I guess I know the answer, but I feel as though I'm going to lead into a question, but I feel as though in a lot of those cases, a lot of these young people then turn to unhealthy coping strategies when
Totally.
they're at home. So we were talking
Totally.
before we started about how you've worked in addiction before.
Yeah.
I guess how do you help them work through those unhealthy coping strategies, especially when the situations are, when they're in an abusive household and they might not have an ability to just remove themselves
Right.
from an unhealthy environment,
Yeah.
and they're turning to these coping strategies? How do you help them, I guess, find alternatives or deal with addiction?
I think the answer to both of those questions, I think that starting from a harm reduction perspective, like makes a lot of sense. It may be like let's say the addiction of choice is like gaming. It may be like, yeah, okay, like gaming for 12 hours a day, like every day is detrimental, but maybe gaming for 4 hours or 6 hours a day is a way that you're kind of needing to cope or needing to manage. And if we can go down from 12 hours to 6 hours, like we've made a significant increase in just the available hours to you in your day to do something else. So I don't really like to go from a place of like that behavior is bad or you shouldn't do that, or, obvious exceptions aside, but more about like, okay, like this is a thing that's helping you right now. It's serving a purpose for you. How can we do that? And also have some space and some time for some of these other things, because sometimes it's like, yeah, like the healthiest thing that I can do is kind of low key dissociate,
Yeah.
and check out of my home environment in whatever form of escapism I want to do that. Like, I think there's some kids and teens who live like that's their lived reality of
Yeah.
like, it's not safe or helpful or healthy for me to be emotionally present and authentic and vulnerable, like in my home.
Yeah.
So to protect myself, to survive, I talk sometimes about like we need to survive to get to a point in life where you can make your own choices.
I think that's such a refreshing point of view, that it's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. It's
Right.
a very realistic point of view that sometimes unhealthy coping strategies are needed just to make it through and to survive to get to the next step.
Exactly. And if that, 4 hours of video game is keeping you from self-harming, or it's keeping you from like shooting heroin. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that are worse for you than that. And if I freak out about the thing that's helping keep you safe, then I feel like a lot of times that pushes. I would hear that sometimes. You mentioned when I worked in addiction, I would hear sometimes like young men. I was a lot of like early 20s men that I worked with at that time. And I would talk about how did you first come to start using? And sometimes it would be like, well, I used to, I would watch this show all the time. I'd play this video game. I'd be doing whatever. And then my parents were like, no, because usually it starts in their early teens for the most part. Like if I'm going to go on to have an addiction problem, like usually I'm starting using, 12, 13, 14. And so it'll be like, well, but my parents kept telling me, you need to get out of the house. You need to get off your phone. Like you need to do this and that. It's like, okay, well now I'm out like running the streets,
Yeah.
and sometimes it puts you in a worse or more dangerous situation. Obviously that's not the case for everybody. And I'm not saying like, let your kids play video games or they're going to get addicted to heroin. Like I'm not trying to say that, but I think being aware that like there is kind of a spectrum of things that they could be doing.
Yeah. I'm curious your take on, so there's different types of addictions clearly, but I've been thinking recently about some clients around sex addiction
Sure.
or pornography addiction,
Yeah.
because sex or masturbation are more natural
Yeah.
in the sense of the answer is not to just never have sex again in your
Sure, right,
life. So it's very different from, heroin, where I think the
Right.
goal is to
To never
eventually
use it again in your life.
Yeah. So how do you help clients in situations like that, where it's not an all or nothing type of thing? It's more, how can they improve their relationship with sex or with masturbation
Yeah.
to where it's not in excess or harmful?
Yeah, 100%. And I actually think that it's really similar to how I conceptualize like eating disorders. Like it's not realistic to be like, if I have a binge eating disorder, I can't say, okay, I'm never going to eat again. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's how do I figure out my relationship to this, natural part of human existence in a way that's not doing harm for me. And when I think about like sex addiction or porn addiction, I think that a similarity in both of them is a lack of ability to be really authentic and vulnerable with another person. So if I have a porn addiction, then it's just me by myself, right? I never have to take those emotional risks of getting to know someone, and forming a relationship with somebody. And a lot of times when I'm seeing sex addiction behaviors, it's also, really kind of like anonymous, just like encounters where there's not that like emotional vulnerability. And I really think that that's kind of the root cause is how do I get comfortable enough and okay enough with myself that I'm comfortable to share that with somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious in terms of young people and what have you seen in terms of porn addiction and technology in that realm about how it's maybe changed their perspective or perception around what relationships should look like.
Yeah.
And I think it blends a lot into like more casual sex or just these ideas of what relationships should look like based on what they've seen, which isn't entirely based in reality.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious
Yeah.
your perspective on that.
Well, I think similarly to my answer a few minutes ago, I think that there's kind of like both extremes. Like I think sometimes, I'd say maybe less commonly, I see that sort of this is just what it's supposed to be, and like all girls, want their hair pulled and want to be choked out. Sometimes I do hear some of that rhetoric, but I would actually say more commonly, I hear this like porn is bad and masturbation is bad and this is shameful and this isn't okay that I'm doing this and I'm really struggling with my feelings of self-worth that, I'm engaging in this behavior that I've morally, decided is wrong. So I do see both, but I would say actually I see this more shame-based one more frequently.
And if never doing it is not, if shaming and blaming myself and feeling guilty for it, if that's not the right approach, I guess where is the line drawn where it becomes a problem? How do you define that?
So I define that very simply. I define it that it's a problem when it's a problem. And that sounds a little flip, right? And a little like, but I mean it very seriously. Like, okay, is it getting in the way of things that are important to me? Am I doing badly in school? Am I not sleeping because I'm staying up all night doing this? Is it getting in the way of my ability to form, meaningful relationships with people my own age? Like, am I skipping meals? Like, okay, yeah, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
But if it's not a problem, then it's not a problem.
And on that, I think it's important for the person to define it, because I think if you define it based on someone telling you that it's a problem, they might have a different viewpoint.
Sure.
I've seen that happen before. And I think the lines could become more blurred that way.
Yeah, and I think it's confusing, especially during this kind of time period of life. You're getting so many different messages about what's okay and what's not okay and what's cool, and all of that. So I might be getting one message from my family. I might be getting another message from, my church or my faith center. I might be getting a different message from social media. I might be getting a different message from all of those from my actual peers.
Yeah.
And they might all be conflicting. And so how do I like make sense of all that just like noise?
Yeah. How do you in your work strengthen that for people to find their authentic self versus what they're being told from everyone else? How do you strengthen that connection?
I think the first step is just identifying like who's the messenger, where is this message coming from? And do they have an agenda? So something that I talk about with young people, I would say maybe a little bit more with girls, but with boys as well, is like, is anybody profiting off this message? Right?
Yeah.
If I am conceptualizing that like, my acne makes me undeserving of love, right? The like acne cream company is making money on me, or like in maybe a more stereotypical male example, like if I need to have like bulky muscles, to be worthy of love, then like, yeah, I'm going to buy this expensive protein powder every month. So I think that that's an important, like look for where's the message coming from and like what's that person or that industry's agenda.
Yeah. what came up for me as you were saying that actually was, how do you help young men balance this idea between like extreme discipline and self-compassion? Because I think too much self-compassion, I never get up out of bed or do anything.
I get a free pass on.
Yeah, but then too much rigidity, and it's, sounds pretty miserable. And
Totally.
and then you see these people that live a very disciplined, rigid life, and then you compare yourself, kind of like we were discussing
Right.
before. You compare yourself to that, and
Right.
it's, well, I'm not as disciplined as that person.
Sure, that guy wakes up at 4 a.m. to go to the gym every day. Like, how come I don't do that?
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of shame and blame and guilt around that. So
Yeah.
how do you help clients balance self-compassion with discipline? Where do you think that balance lies?
I think that's such a great question because I really think that self-compassion is at the root of a lot of our therapeutic work. I think that if you cannot have compassion and grace for yourself, I saw this thing once and it was like, if, beating myself up was going to work, it would have worked by now.
Yeah.
Right?
Couldn't
Like we've
agree
tried
more.
that.
Yeah.
And, you don't get to therapy without having tried that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that self-compassion maybe sometimes can look like parenting ourselves or reparenting ourselves. And so a compassionate parent isn't going to say, yeah, honey, like you can totally stay up until 3 a.m. Like that sounds great. Right? They're going to say, it's time for bed, and I'm giving you this boundary and this expectation because I love you and I care about you and I want you to be able to succeed and thrive.
Yeah.
And so I think of self-compassion more of being that parent figure, like to yourself.
Yeah. So having boundaries towards
Right.
yourself.
Right.
And speaking of boundaries, I definitely want to get into how you help clients set boundaries, because something I've admired in your work, and I've shared this with you before, is your ability to set a boundary. You strike this beautiful balance of setting a boundary and still having compassion. So you could be firm in what you're saying, but it doesn't, I don't know. I feel like I personally come in a little too hot sometimes when I try to set a boundary, but I feel like you find this beautiful balance of setting a boundary in a gentle way. But I think you know where the line is, and I think you're not afraid to tell someone to fuck off if it comes to that,
Sure.
right? So how do you have assertiveness and be gentle at the same time? How did
Right.
you find that balance? How do you help clients find that balance?
I think that some of that I learned like trial by fire, right? It's like one of my first jobs out of grad school is working at that male rehab that I was telling you about. And like, do you know what I mean? I'm working with these like young male, like drug addicts.
Yeah.
And like sometimes they'd come in spicy. And if I was just like, oh, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't talk about that in group. Do you know what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
going to get eaten alive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so figuring out a way to feel confident in myself and in what I'm saying, right? To know that the thing that I'm saying is reasonable and appropriate and truthful, right? So like, hey, you can't describe your hookups during our process group. That's a reasonable, clear, like truthful thing, for me to say. There's nothing weird about it. I don't feel like,
Yeah.
do you know that sort
Yeah.
of like embarrassed feeling?
Yeah.
Like I feel like strong and in myself
Yeah.
to say like, no, like that's not an okay thing. We don't do that here.
Yeah. And how did you find that for yourself? Because I think a lot of people are trying to find that in themselves, that confidence to know that what they're saying is truthful and that there's validity to it. How did you find that within yourself? How have you done that work to go grow confident in what you're saying?
Definitely a lot of my own therapy. Shout out to therapy.
Shout out to therapy.
But I think also in just, I don't know if I have a great answer to like the how of it, but sort of like the process that happens is just this center within yourself where you know that the truth lives, and you know that it's there, and you know that the things that you're saying are based in reality, and being able to hold on to that when there's people like spinning bullshit like all around you, right, is really helpful. And so again, like when I was working in that setting, people would come in with like very wild stories
Yeah.
that may or may not have had any connection to the truth. you know? And so
Yeah.
I think that that's really helped me even now, like when clients come in and helping them identify. We were talking the other day about helping clients identify their own blind spots, you know, because they can't tell you about a problem if they're not aware that it's a problem. But if I'm kind of listening and looking for, oh, what's the piece that's missing? Like the story doesn't totally add up. Like I feel like I need another bridge to get me from here to there. Like that helps me to bring their attention to it. So I think that just over time, realizing that like, no, I do have reasonable judgment. You know, if I feel like something seems
Yeah.
fishy, it's probably because it is.
Yeah.
You know, not to say I'm infallible, of course, but just trusting myself really is what I think it comes down to.
I was just going to say that. Just learning to trust your opinion
Yeah.
and trusting that you've done enough work that your perspective and your perception of events is true.
Right.
And you trust yourself more than you might trust someone else.
And I think that for a lot of people, especially if you've been in a family or in a relationship where you've experienced any like gaslighting or the truth has been a little bit more malleable, you know, or just things like that, that can be a really hard skill to learn, you know, but just being able to say, like, I could point to this wall all day long and be like, it's purple. You know, Alex, it's purple. Like, what are
Yeah.
you talking about? It's purple.
Yeah.
Right? But like you knowing, like, okay, it's green, you know, no matter what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm colorblind, so that's not the best example,
Not
but
a good analogy. It's actually purple.
yeah, I believe you. I don't trust my opinion when it comes to that. I'm curious how you help guide couples in relationships where maybe not the couple itself, but maybe one of the individuals in the couple when there is abuse or
Yeah.
gaslighting.
Yeah,
How
for
do you
sure.
help them work through that? And what if there's a level of dependence in the couple where whether it's financial dependence or emotional dependence, how do you help empower them to leave an unhealthy relationship or to understand the truth and learn to trust themselves?
You know, I think to go back to something we were talking about a few minutes ago, like if I come to you and I say, hey, this is a problem, that's not going to have as much weight as if you get to that conclusion on your own. So I spend a lot of time asking about, like, how does it feel for you when your partner responds, you know, in that angry way? Or how safe does it feel for you to express a difference of opinion to your partner? When do you feel most calm and relaxed with your partner? When do you feel the most elevated? You know, and then I might throw some just like education and information about, oh, you know, from my experience, a healthy relationship is a relationship where there's space for disagreements. You know, how does that show
Yeah.
up in your relationship? Like, does that feel like what happens for you, or is it a little different?
So allowing them to kind of get to their own conclusions has
Because
a
if I
lot
just say,
more.
like, hey, homie, like you're in an abusive relationship, like GTFO, do you know what I mean? Like, what is that going to do? I'm just going to be another person in their life telling them that their partner's, you know, an asshole.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So it's asking the right questions to get them to their own answers.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. What made you become a therapist? Tell me a little more about your own story.
I felt like I got some really helpful like mental health care and therapy when I was a teenager and a young adult, and it really just like steered me and shaped me, and I think really took me in a path that, you know, otherwise I think it would have been a pretty dark path. And seeing just the impact that a few like solid professionals at the right point in my life, you know, the way that it helped me turn my life into something that I'm really proud of is just such a gift.
Yeah.
And something that I want to be able to give to other people.
Yeah. That's great. How come you like working with teens as opposed to maybe a different population?
I think that like teens into like college age, I would say, is such a great and interesting group of people because they have enough agency and autonomy that they can make their own decisions, right? If I'm working with kids and they're like, I don't want to go to school. Do you know what I mean? It's like, well, too bad you're in the minivan anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But a teenager can very much be like, I don't want to go to school and I'm not going and you can't make me.
Yeah.
And so I think that's interesting to me, like working with that autonomy. But I also think it's just such a pivotal, like blossoming kind of, you know, I don't know if that's kind of choosy, but like just
No, I
being
understand.
able to figure out who you are and what you want out of life and making all these decisions about what am I going to do with my career? And like, is school and education important to me? Do I want to be pursuing, a trade or a career? Like, do I want to move out of my parents' house or do I want to stay home? Like, what are the pros and cons of both? Like, just all of those big life decisions are so interesting.
Kind of coming back to something I asked about parents before, but how do you navigate situations where you're helping them find themselves and their path, and their parents have a very different idea of what that path should look like, and they're like, you know what, this therapy is bullshit?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I've had parents pull their kids out.
What do you do?
So I think the first step is having a good alliance and relationship with the parent. And again, I think it comes down to trust. I think I need the parent to trust me, and trust that I'm not trying to steer their kid astray. Again, I absolutely have had parents pull their kids out of therapy, and it's like, you're changing and shaping our child into a version of them that I don't like. Yeah. And that's always, I think, a really sad day.
Yeah.
But I think that if I can have enough trust and rapport with the parent to help them understand, like, hey, the point of this period in life is for them to be trying out new stuff, and figuring out who they are, and, and kind of trust like the values and the work that you've already done, and let them figure it out on their own.
How how much of your work is geared towards educating parents on?
I would say a lot.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No. I mean, answer the question.
Yeah, because I think that, you don't get a manual, you don't get a child development textbook just because you had a baby. And I think that sometimes, especially if it's like their first child who's kind of becoming a teenager or becoming a young adult, or maybe they're following, maybe siblings like 1, 2, and 3 all went exactly this path, and now sibling 4 is doing this.
Yeah.
Right? It can feel really scary for the parent because they love their kid and they want their kid to be successful and they don't want them to make any mistakes. And so if the things that I see, as a parent, if I perceive that my kid is like making mistakes, that feels really scary and really worrying. And so I really try to approach it from a place of compassion, of I believe that you are making these choices because you love your kid and you want the best for them. Let me give you some additional information about just child development and normalizing some of these things so that you can make even better decisions for your kids.
How do you navigate the cultural dynamics at times? I know in the Hispanic culture, I've had a lot of clients, the machismo. Like, how do you navigate that where parents there's a cultural element?
Sure. And I've seen this in, some different types of cultures. Sometimes I've seen it in, various like ethnic backgrounds, but also religious backgrounds. And I think that part of it is starting, kind of like what I was saying before, starting from the perception that we're on the same team, that me and parents want the same thing, which is for kid to be thriving, be successful, be happy and healthy, and, all those wonderful things. And I think that when I can start from that place of like a bridge, sometimes with more success than others, right? But we can try to educate of like, I hear that this has been the way that you've been trying to discipline, for example, or that this value is really important to you. I'm a lot of curiosity, I'm curious like what it might feel like if we shifted this like just a little bit, how would it feel if we just like tipped the needle a little bit more this direction? Does that feel okay for you? Does that not really feel in line? And there's always space for them, for parent, right, to come back to me, say, oh no, like I could never, allow a kid to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then, okay, that just means for me as a therapist, I need to find a different path. Maybe it is that like video games are just off limits in your household. I'm not here to argue with you about your parenting decisions. I'm here to work with, the system that is in place and help kid find a path forward.
I'm thinking about also from a female perspective, like we've talked a lot about young men, but from a young woman perspective, for the young women that you work with, what are some of the patterns that you've seen there? So, and I'm just going to start from a couple that I've seen, is just similar black and white in the sense of, I guess, playing characters in a way. Yeah. So, whether it's trying to get attention from the boys, or playing the character of the really smart one, or I don't know, it's all these labels. Like, how do you What are patterns that you've seen in females, and I guess how do you help them build a self-esteem that, do you approach it the same way as you would a young boy?
I was thinking about that as you were talking about, and I was thinking that, for as much, there definitely are huge like cultural, social, societal like differences between, my male and my female clients. And also like so much of it is the same. So much of it is for whatever reason, don't feel that just me as I am is enough. And so maybe that means I need to kind of try on these different roles, and it's almost like experimenting. Like, oh, maybe if I'm, this really like cool, popular kid, then XYZ result will happen. But I think that a lot of it is just coming from a place of trying to figure out who I am and trying to figure out if I'm okay with who that person is.
Yeah. I'm curious. I have a few.
I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, because I have a young daughter, and I've gotten the question before from some of my male friends around like, oh, are you going to be really protective?
Sure.
And it seems that as a culture, we kind of encourage our sons to, hook up with a bunch of girls and to be really cool and popular. And then we, as dads especially, if we have a daughter, it's like, be protective. Don't let her like hang out with boys, And I kind of struggle with, I am a protector in a certain way, but who am I to limit my daughter if I wouldn't limit a son,
right.
And I guess, what do you make of that? I guess the double standard.
I mean, I think that it's real. I think that it's totally present. I think that both my young men and my young women talk about it and are aware of it, and see it as a problem. So that's actually something that I'm really curious to see if, kind of what this generation of teens and adolescents does with that as they enter their maturity and adulthood. I'm curious to see if some of that starts shifting, because both the boys and the girls that I work with are like, dude, that's fucked up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that might be shifting a little bit culturally. I also do think that there's places where it is for sure not shifting.
Yeah. And where are some of those places?
I mean, I think that there's certain cultural traditions that really hold on to that. I think that there's certain faith traditions that really hold on to that. I think that there's just a little, I don't want to call anything out like too specifically, but I think there's some places.
This is a safe space.
But I do think, and I want to say that I think that it does harm. I think that having really rigid gender roles is harmful for both boys and girls. And if you're out here, out there listening to this and you're like, I have really different rules for my boys versus my girls, like I think it would be really helpful for you to take a look at why you have those rules in place.
Couldn't agree more. Well said. I'm curious also about, we've talked a lot about boys and girls, but what about this concept of transgender? And there's a lot of different viewpoints on, the appropriate age for someone to make a decision based on their gender.
Yeah.
And how they feel. So I guess, where do you stand on that? Is there an appropriate age to, make a somewhat permanent decision in terms of gender? Or do you think we should be steering them in a certain direction? Or I don't know. What do you make of that?
I have a few thoughts on that. I work a lot with trans, non-binary, gender expansive kids in my practice. So this is definitely something that's really real, and that I see both, my young people and their parents and families really struggling with how to make sense of this. So the first thing that I want to say is I don't think it's a simple black and white, like one size fits all solution. I've worked with a kid who, when he was 4 years old, was like, looking at his Barbies and being like, how come I don't look like that? And telling his mom, like, I think, like I've been like body swapped, or like an alien came and like changed my body. Do you know what I mean? And that's a really different case than the kid who's 16 and decides like, I'm not sure that I really feel like a girl anymore.
Yeah.
And not to say that both of those aren't valid, but like, I'm going to be looking at those things really differently, clinically and professionally. I also think, and this is an interesting thing. I think you'll find this interesting. I've met with many more female to male transgender than I have male to female transgender kids.
Why do you think that
And
is?
my theory, this is solely my theory, but my theory is that it's really hard in our society for a boy to say, I want to be a girl. And it's
Yeah.
much easier for a girl to say, I'd rather be a boy.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I also had an experience not too long ago where it seemed as though if a client comes in and they are saying they're not sure about their gender, or they're saying they might want to switch genders, but they also just have a lack of identity.
Sure. Yep. I see that sometimes as well.
It's almost like switching. Is it a real gender thing for them? Or is it, this character that I'm playing isn't working?
Right.
Let me play a different character that might make me feel better.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a right answer, but I guess how do you help them work through, is this a gender thing or is this an identity thing? Like, would you be better off keeping your gender as is and doing identity work to strengthen your connection to self, or, you know, making a more permanent decision to, like, what if there's a regret later?
Right. I want to just start by saying that, like, I absolutely believe in everybody's right to be the gender that they feel that they are, you know, and I think that that's valid and fair, and, you know, I always want to be affirming. I also do think that, so example, I had a client once that I worked with, a young girl, and she told me, she came into session one day and told me that she wanted to be a boy. And I was like, oh, okay, like, tell me more about that. Like, how did you come to this conclusion? And she said, well, everybody on my Discord server said that girls can't be good at video games. So I want to be a boy so that I can be good at video games.
Yeah. Yep.
And so in that case, it was more, I believe, of a case of just like education.
Yeah.
You know, and like, hey, you can still be a girl. Like, you can still identify as female and as a woman and really be into video games or like trucks, you know, or be, I don't know, want to be a power lifter. Like, those are not things that you have to change your gender to be able to do. I also do think that, you know, if we were to go back in time, you know, I don't know, 50, even 20 years, I have to figure out as a teenager, you know, am I a jock? Am I a smart kid? Like, do I follow the rules? Like, who, you know, am I my parents' religion? Am I my parents' political beliefs? Now kids have to do all of that. And they also have to figure out, and am I demisexual?
Yeah.
Am I aromantic, but, you know, heterosexual? Like, am I non-binary? Like, I feel like there's so much more choice. And in a lot of ways, that's a really wonderful and a really beautiful thing. And people can find language and ways to describe themselves that maybe they wouldn't have been able to in the past. But I think it also creates a lot of confusion for what's already a really confusing time.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just processing everything you just said. It is a really confusing time. I guess, how do you see that, I guess, leading into depression and suicide and bullying? And I mean, it seems to me that it's all pretty connected.
Yeah.
I guess what are the answers? How the hell do we?
I have them all, Alex.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking. You seem to have them all. I turn to you frequently.
Yes. One thing that I will just say before you move on, you know, as we're kind of transitioning from LGBT kids to suicide, is I think it's really important to continue to verbalize the message just to parents and adults and people that might have teens and young people in their lives, that those kids are at higher risk of suicide. And having just one affirming adult in their life significantly decreases their risk of suicide. So before you go to a place of saying, I'm going to kick my kid out, or I'm not going to use these dumb pronouns, consider if you'd rather have a gay kid or a dead kid.
I think that's a strong message.
Came out a little hot, but I stand by it.
No, I think it was warranted.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure to mention that.
Yeah.
And I totally forgot the actual question you asked me. So
I think you kind of answered it, saying that one affirming adult can
really a
be
life
the
or
difference.
death difference.
Yeah.
You know, and so it may feel for maybe you as parent or you as adult, oh, my kid's going through a phase, you know, or like this isn't going to stick or whatever. But it doesn't cost you any energy to just not be an asshole to them,
Yeah.
you know? And so if they tell you, I want to go by this name or use these pronouns, okay, cool.
Yeah. I think what I've seen a lot is how religion could play a large part
For sure.
in acceptance or lack thereof of
Yeah.
some of these kids. How do you help kids in that situation where their parents aren't accepting because
Yeah.
it goes against their religion?
100%. I've had these kids, you know, I've
Yeah.
worked with them. And it's really, really hard because not only for a lot of them, like the religion is really important to them too, you know, and it's like, this is something that I was raised in and, you know, my church family or, you know, my synagogue family is part of my community. And if they knew this about me, like, would they cast me out? And I think that's a really hard thing to grapple with. And it makes me really sad.
Yeah, it seems that a lot of these kids have a choice to make, whether it's like be authentic to who I am and be rejected,
Right.
or pretend that I'm not this
Sure.
and try to be accepted playing this fake character.
And I'll see some of my kids like really consciously make that decision, you know, of like, I know that I'm gay or I'm trans, and I know that like my parents would kick me out or that our relationship would significantly change or I would no longer be welcome at, you know, family functions.
Yeah.
And like that's a real, imagine having to weigh that choice, you know, when you're 15.
Yeah. So it seems like a lot of them may just be biding their time and
I totally see that. Or
Yeah.
it'll be, I'm going to start, you know, hormones after I move out. Or, you know, it's just not worth it.
yeah. And how do you help them, I guess, wait that out and deal with the misery that is temporary,
Right.
but you know, misery nonetheless
Sure.
before they're able to make some of these decisions.
I think that I really validate that it's their decision to make. You know, I really empathize of like how unbearable it feels to have to play a role every day. I talk a lot about how easy it can be for that mask to start kind of bleeding into me and to lose sight of who I actually am. And so I really try to keep my sessions as a space where they can be like the full
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. I think getting to know you, I think you are that affirming adult that so many of these kids do need. So
Yeah.
I think the work you do is so incredibly valuable.
Thank you.
And I think all of your clients are lucky to have you, even if some of those parents might
Like,
not
don't know
think
it at
so.
the time.
But I think it is such a privilege to be able to see the work that you do, and it's just a privilege to know you. And I
Thank you.
thank you so much for coming on here and
Yeah.
sharing some of the work that you do. And where can people find you?
You can find me at my website, which is tbh, to be honest, therapy.org. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook at the same page, TBH Therapy. Hit me up. I want to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Ella.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure being on.
It's a pleasure to have you.